Good day. My name is Dr. Rollin McCraty, and I am Director of Research at the HeartMath Institute, or the HeartMath Research Center, as it's often called. And today I'm going to talk about how the heart and brain communicate and how that's reflected in a thing called heart rate variability. So I'll talk a little bit about what heart rate variability is and how it's measured and why that's important, and also how we can use heart rate variability as a way to understand what's going on inside of our body and our nervous system, and use that as a feedback signal to help us get into a more optimal state that has a lot of benefits. And I'm also going to talk about how we can be more personally coherent, but also how coherence applies in the social context and also globally. So that's a lot to wrap into one presentation, but we'll try and catch the highlights and pretty summarize some key things that we've done over the last 30 years. Really, any of these topics deserve their own probably whole presentation, but hopefully we can get an overview here. So just to start a little bit about with the HeartMath Institute. So we're a nonprofit research and education organization, and we provide simple, user-friendly mental and emotional self-regulation tools and techniques that help people of all ages and all cultures use in the moment to relieve stress and break through to greater levels of personal balance, stability, creativity, intuitive insight, and fulfillment. And in fact, one of the things I won't talk about today in depth, but is that some of our research that has shown that the heart is very much involved in intuition and sort of that bridge between accessing what we can think of as our higher self or spirit. Different cultures have different names for it. We just call it our large around here. So there's another deeper aspect that then I'll also go into today. But starting with coherence, it's probably good to get some clarity on what we mean by that word, because we use it in a number of ways and in a broad context. But in general, coherence in physics anyway, in science, implies order, structure, and harmony. A connection within and among systems or parts of a system. And that's true whether we're talking about an atom, organ systems, or bodies, people, teams that work together, or society. Hopefully that helps give a little bit of context to coherence. So we talk about really three primary spheres or domains of coherence: personal, and also right down to the physiology, which I'll talk quite a bit about, but also social coherence, which we'll cover a definition of later, and global coherence and what we mean by that and some of the ways that we're measuring that. Physiologically speaking, we use coherence to define the degree of order and harmony that's going on within the body's rhythmic systems. So physiological coherence describes the degree of order, harmony, and stability in the various rhythmic activities within any living system over any given time period. And I'll show you some examples of that in a moment. So heart-brain communication, I think we should start there. And the heart and brain communicate in four primary ways. So today I'm going to focus mostly on the nervous system and how the neural signals of the heart and brain communicate. But we'll talk a little bit about one of the other ways, which is energetically, later on. So start with actually a well-known fact in history, but it's been largely forgotten. And that is that the heart literally sends more neural traffic, quite a bit more in fact, to the brain than the brain sends to the heart. That's been known since the late 1800s, and in the beginning of the psychology, it was well known and a major consideration in psychological models. And that was after about the 1930s and late 20s and 30s that the paradigm shift, and that knowledge has been mostly forgotten. Now, there's a long history, actually hundreds of publications and studies showing that the signals from the heart, the neural signals, the rhythm, the rate, the quality, the structure of these signals have profound effects on the brain and almost all brain centers, in fact, but especially the ones involved in the frontal cortex, our ability to self-regulate, be self-aware, but also in the motor strips or reaction times, and also there are direct neural inputs from the heart into the centers of the brain involved in emotional experience. So for a large degree, we're starting to understand why terms and phrases in our language are so common. I mean, most people don't say to their wife or husband, "I love you with all my brain," right? It's usually they put their hand on their heart, and it's something to do with the heart. So there's been a long historical relationship with people intuitively understanding that there's more to the heart than just an organ that has to do with regulating blood flow and pumping blood. Now, what wasn't known when a lot of these studies were done in the 70s and 80s, showing that the heart affects brain function, was that the heart actually has an intrinsic nervous system that's nicknamed the heart brain. So this is a complex neural system within the heart itself. And so the afferents or ascending pathways from the heart are more numerous than the ones coming down by a ratio of about 9 to 1, in fact. So this here we're looking at a kind of a block diagram of the main neural communication pathways between the heart and brain. And we see that the ascending, or technically called afferent pathways, exist both in the vagus nerves, which are the primary nerves of the parasympathetic nervous system. And there's different estimates, but it's between 80 to 90% of the thousands of neural fibers in each of the two vagus nerves are afferent or ascending. But also in the spinal cord, in that system as well, about 20% of all those neural pathways are also afferent. So there's a lot of information going from the body back to the brain, which it's then interpreting for many reasons. The vagus system is the more dominant one in terms of carrying information from the body, but especially from the heart. In fact, the largest source of activity going back to the brain from the body is from the heart and cardiovascular system. And then here you can also see the intrinsic cardiac nervous system in our block diagram. And this is a whole kind of technical presentation in its own right, but as it turns out, the field that studies this is called neurocardiology, but most of the modern textbooks and medical schools are actually still haven't caught up yet. In fact, all the neural connections from the brain to the heart first connect with the nervous system within the heart, not directly to the tissues. And there's a lot of implications of that we won't have time to get into today. Now, I talked about these afferent or ascending signals, and here we see a kind of a block diagram of some of, certainly not all, but some of the main neural pathways from once these signals get up to our brainstem. The NTS, that there's direct and strong neural connections to pretty much all of our key brain centers. Hypothalamus, thalamus is an important one, and the amygdala. I'll come back to those a little bit later. So we now have a very clear understanding of the flow of these neural signals and how they can modulate perception and brain function. So this gets me into heart rate variability, which gives us a window into understanding the dynamics that are occurring in our autonomic nervous system and the communication between the heart and the brain. So technically, one of the common definitions of heart rate variability is that it's a measure of neural cardiac function that reflects heart-brain interactions and autonomic nervous system dynamics. Now, here we see a diagram of what HRV looks like. So the red line on the bottom is, of course, the electrocardiogram. And if you look closely, you can see that the time intervals between each pair of heartbeats is slightly changing. And the blue line on the top is technically called instantaneous heart rate. In other words, what's the beats per minute equivalent of each pair of heartbeats? And we do that because beats per minute is the way most of our brains are so used to thinking about this. It's really measured in milliseconds between each pair of heartbeats. So to measure heart rate variability, it's very different than heart rate. So heart rate, obviously, you only need to count how many times the heart beat in a minute. But in reality, our heart rate is changing with each and every heartbeat. So in heart rate variability, we have to sample the data at very high rates to really measure accurately those time intervals between each and every pair of heartbeats. So the blue line is showing the rhythm, actually. If we did not have heart rate variability or this beat-to-beat change, there would be no heart rhythm. This is what underlies it. So if we had no variability and the time between each heartbeat was the same, the blue line on top would basically be a flat line. And that's not a good thing, as we'll see in a moment. So now here we're looking at a person's ambulatory heart rate variability. These are done with recorders that record the electrocardiogram as they go about their normal day, much like a Holter recorder, only much smaller and more comfortable to wear. So each one of the traces you see here is an hour's worth of data. And so it just kind of shows you that the heart rhythms are dynamic. They're always changing, and all these changes are reflecting measurable changes that are occurring in our nervous system, in our autonomic nervous system. So here in the second and third hour, we see periods of what we call coherence, which I'll show you more clearly in a minute what that is and why that's an important state. But also down in the lower part of the graph, during nighttime, we see what restful sleep looks like and also what dreaming looks like in REM sleep. In fact, we can even tell from looking at the heart rhythms during dreaming, whether it's a pleasant dream, a nightmare, that kind of thing, the kind of the emotional quality of the dream. But also as you become familiar with these rhythms and patterns, you can pretty much tell almost a person's personality or what kind of an emotional state they're in at any time, more or less throughout the day. So I mentioned this thing called coherence or heart coherence, also referred to as cardiac coherence and so on in the scientific literature. But heart coherence, we now know, many studies later, over 250 studies now have been done, most of those independent from our work now since we discovered this, is that heart coherence is a highly efficient functional mode that is associated with increased self-regulatory capacity. In other words, our ability to inhibit our impulses, not charge things on a credit card if we're on a budget, or eat the other piece of cake or something if we're on a diet and so on, but especially socially, as I'll get into. But also the efficient utilization of our energy resources. And coherence is now associated with a number of benefits to our mental landscape, to our cognitive function, memory, these types of things, even test scores. A lot of studies now in health outcomes and also in our behaviors. So really a lot of our focus here is teaching people how to better self-regulate, as we believe it's a failure of self-regulation that really underlies most of the problems we have in modern society and in people's health. It can really be traced back to a failure of self-regulation. So why is heart rate variability important? So it used to be thought, I kind of alluded to this earlier, that a sign of good health was a steady heart rate. In other words, the time between each pair of heartbeats would be more or less the same, and that was taught for many years in healthcare. We now know that's completely wrong, and it's exactly the opposite. So in a healthy person, a resilient person, we have high levels of this intrinsic, normal, or natural heart rate variability. So we want variability, and it's also proving to be one of the best markers of aging, because we now know that we have more variability, heart rate variability, when we're young, and it steadily declines as we age. In fact, we can measure a person's HRV and tell within a couple of years how old they are, if they're on a healthy trajectory. Now, we can have lower variability than we should have for our age, and that's not a good thing, because that is just one of the strongest, and it's also an independent risk factor for future health problems. And it's a wide variety of things that HRV is correlated with. But it also, in fact, first shown in some of the Framingham research, that low HR variability for our age is associated with all-cause mortality. So it's a really important fundamental rhythm. Now, so low HRV basically reflects, you could think of as depletion of the autonomic nervous system. And it's associated with inflammation, congestive heart failure, diabetes, hypertension, cancer, weight gain, metabolic syndrome, and the list goes on. So the thing about measuring how much HRV a person has is that it's a great overall functional capacity measure, but if it's lower than it should be, you know you've got somebody at risk. But it's not going to be diagnostic or specific as to whether that may manifest in the future with a higher incidence of cancer or metabolic syndrome or diabetes or whatever. It takes a little, but it gives you a very quick, in fact, we now have very quick ways to assess the overall amount of HRV a person has. This is a fairly new device. It's called the M-Wave Pro Plus. And a little background here, we spent several years here in our laboratory trying to figure out a short-term or a very short way that you could assess a person's HRV that correlated with their overall variability, which really should be done over 24 hours because it's variable. So you have to be careful about just doing a short window. And what we found, looking at lots of different protocols, at the end of the day, what was the best was the shortest and the simplest. And it's a challenge test of sorts, where you basically have your client or patient do paced breathing at a very specific rhythm that maximizes the amount of HRV their system can generate, and breathe as deeply as they comfortably can. So that's a very kind of guided assessment that's in this device called the M-Wave Pro Plus. And that really challenged the nervous system and asks the question, what is the maximum heart rate variability their nervous system is capable of producing? So that simple test can be done in 1 minute and has by far the highest correlations to 24-hour measures of overall HRV. So it's a great quick screening tool that almost anybody can use to really get a quick functional assessment of their client or patient. Now, I showed you a few slides ago about HRV over a day, right, hour-long rhythms. Now, if we kind of blow that up a little bit and zero in on what these rhythms look like, that's what we're seeing here. These two patterns of HRV, and patterns is the key here, because it's the overall kind of amplitude, if you will, of the variability that reflects the how much, and that's what gets less with age. But there's another very important aspect of HRV that we need to take a deeper look at, and that's what's the pattern of it, and that's what we're illustrating here. So in the top graph here, this is what the heart rhythm of this person looks like when they're feeling frustrated, and we call this an incoherent rhythm. But these incoherent rhythms can be various degrees of incoherence or chaos, you could think of, but things like impatience, worry, anxiety, all reflect are in these more incoherent rhythms. Now, it's also, with some practice, and we're developing new tools to do this, you can actually find, and with about 75% accuracy actually, that there are very specific different patterns that are specific to different emotional states. And this is a pretty cool finding. But all of these incoherent rhythms are associated with what's called cortical inhibition, and this actually predates our research, going back to the early 70s, that when we have these incoherent rhythms, and I'll give you the mechanisms in a second, that basically inhibits or interferes with cognitive processes. Now, this is the same person on the bottom we're looking at, and this is what we call a coherent heart rhythm. Now, just one of those little sine wave type patterns you see there is about 20 heartbeats. So this is showing the accelerations and deaccelerations, but in a coherent or ordered and harmonious pattern. And this is associated with optimal cognitive function, but it's also the natural state our heart rhythm goes into, or beats out, if you will, when we're feeling good. So this is our original research back in the 1990s when we were looking at positive emotions. What's the body do when we feel something like appreciation or compassion? This is the rhythm that the heart would shift into, and it's a very distinct state shift. And we looked at all the physiological measures we could think of, and we're a pretty well-equipped laboratory. All of the things you can possibly measure, brain waves, of course, and skin conductance, and many other things. But it's the heart and the rhythmic pattern of the heart that most accurately reflects these inner states. And so that's got us started down a path to understanding why and how coherence was so important. So we now know, many years later, can really say with confidence that this coherent heart state is really the physiology of optimal function and optimal performance. Now, it's important a lot of people will confuse coherence with relaxation, because so many programs focus on need to relax and chill out and get rid of this bad guy, sympathetic nervous system. So relaxation is obviously an important skill and state to be in when it's time to relax, but it's not the same as coherence. So you can see on this graph here what a heart rhythm looks like in relaxation. You actually tend to have lower state-specific variability during that period, whereas when you're in a coherent state, the variability is a little bit higher. But if you look at the power spectrums of these rhythms on the right-hand side of this figure, you can see they're very different. And so coherence is really reflecting a much deeper state of synchronization and global order within all of our physiology. And again, this would be a whole more than an hour presentation just to go into the depths of what all's going physiologically on this. So one of the important things about coherence and incoherence, looking at the patterns, is that they're independent of our heart rate. So to be in a relaxed state, by definition, you have to have a lowered heart rate, or increased vagal outflow, as it's called, more parasympathetic, it slows heart rate. So it's ultimate relaxation is taking a nap or going to sleep. So the fact that the patterns in coherence and incoherence are independent of heart rate is really important. So it means, in fact, some of our work in law enforcement and and also in sports and sports performance have shown beyond a doubt that with some training and practice, you can learn to be in a coherent state at very high heart rates, right? So there are a lot of times when you really need to be expending energy. You need to take care of business, but you want to be in this coherent state. And think of coherence in this context as equaling composure, the ability to really maintain our center and optimally perform cognitively. Our reaction times are increased. our ability to really self-regulate and maintain our composure. One of the aspects of coherence and measures of coherence is how in sync things are. So here I'd like to show you one example, there are many more, of our physiology or physiological systems becoming more synchronized when we're in a coherent state. So here on top we're looking at respiration, the breathing rhythm. In the center, the heart rhythm, like HRB, the beat-to-beat change in heart rate. And on the bottom we're looking at beat-to-beat change in blood pressure, which by the way also varies beat to beat. It's not a steady, static thing like we tend to think of it either. And in the center of the figure here, you see where the dotted line is. This is where this person used one of the HeartMath self-regulation techniques called quick coherence. I won't go into the steps of that now, but it's basically where you focus in the area of the heart and shift your emotional state and actively appreciate something. And we see a rather fast, and this can actually happen with practice within a space of a couple heartbeats, dramatic shift in the rhythmic patterns across all of these physiological rhythms. And when we do the analysis called spectrum analysis, in this figure you're seeing here, we can see that all these rhythms have become synchronized and actually literally entrained in this case. And entrainment and synchronization are two different things, but in this case they're actually entrained and phase locked together. And this is a high efficient state. The heart's doing a lot less work and getting a lot more done. Our blood pressure is actually lower in these kind of cases, but yet there's more cardiac outflow and so on. So that's just one of many measures. We can also measure how synchronized the heart and brain are in terms of looking at our brain waves or brain rhythms and the activity of the heart. And as it turns out, that can be measured. And all of the brain rhythms, most are familiar with alpha, for example. But it's just sitting around in a normal state, about 15% of our alpha rhythm is actually synchronized to the cardiac cycle, to the heart. But when we get in this coherent state, that is significantly increased. And that's one of the underlying pillars, I think, of the increased optimal or cognitive function. So the graph you're seeing here is fairly simple to understand, but it took many, many years and a lot of labs around the world to really work out and really validate all of the mechanisms here. So as I mentioned earlier, we have all this afferent or ascending information coming up through both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nerve fibers, and they first come into the medulla in the brainstem. But from there are some of those neural pathways I showed earlier, but one of those is a strong and direct neural pathway directly to the thalamus. Now the thalamus has many roles and functions, but one of those, and this has been well known for many, many years now, is that the thalamus synchronizes the electrical activity of the entire brain. So if you think about it, for information from our sensory systems and cognition to occur, the neural systems that underlie those processes have to be in sync. They literally have to be synchronized. And this is done through these, they're called thalamic cortical loops that synchronize neural activity in the brain. So when we're in an incoherent state, those incoherent rhythmic neural patterns that correlate with the HRB pattern are impinging on the thalamus. And the effect of this is they basically inhibit or interfere with the thalamus's ability to synchronize global electrical activity of the brain. And this is easy to measure in studies where you look at reaction times, visual fields, coordination, these types of things. It's been done in labs and confirmed all over the world, and people looking into the deeper mechanisms and so on. However, the part of the brain that's most profoundly affected in these incoherent states is our frontal cortex. Now, the frontal cortex has of course, a lot of functions, but it mainly, from an evolutionary perspective, gives us the ability to have foresight. So foresight is a big umbrella term. It covers things like discrimination of appropriate behavior, abstract thinking, appreciation of achieving a goal, in fact, even being able to set a goal, are all frontal cortex things. And these are pretty refined skills. And if you think about it, the neural mechanisms and machinery that underlies these capacities has got to be in sync to perform optimally. So when when we're in this incoherent state, those are the processes that are taken offline first. So this can be why when we're angry, which creates incoherence, or upset emotionally, and when we have these coherent rhythms now impinging on the thalamus, people can tend to say or do something they regret later. So it's really kind of inhibiting our ability to self-regulate, if you will. Now, on the other hand, if we're in a coherent state, we have a coherent rhythm, like you see on the right side of the figure here, impinging on the thalamus. It facilitates and enhances global cortical synchronization. So this results in improved reaction times, better coordination, why this is very useful and helpful in athletics and sports, and so on. But it especially enhances and optimizes cognitive function and our capacity and ability to self-regulate, much more so than our normal walking around state. So what this means in day-to-day life is before making an important decision or going into a stressful situation that you know tends to be stressful for you or emotionally upsetting, is take a couple of minutes. Just get your physiology settled down, get coherent. And again, this is not the same as relaxation, but getting your systems in sync and the heart and brain in sync has a carryover effect before you go into that next situation. And this has been shown in multiple ways and in multiple studies now. So some of the things that are pretty well established now, being in this heart coherent state, is that it reflects increased synchronization in our higher level brain systems. So the circuits between the frontal cortex, the amygdala, and the medulla, and all these types of things, which underlies our capacity to self-regulate. It also reflects increased parasympathetic or vagal activity, which is an important measure as well. Entrainment between physiological rhythms and the coordinated outflow or activity between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. And that's also a really important thing. Increased heart-brain synchronization. And one of the things I didn't talk about, but is also important, is increased what's called cardiovascular system resonance, which has to do with resonant waves being set up in the system, which helps blood flow and perfusion. When we're talking about our psychological or mental capacities, again, many studies now have shown that especially it helps increase our ability to self-regulate, to maintain our composure, especially in challenging situations. The traffic jams of life, if you will. That's when we really need to be able to have techniques that can help us self-regulate and get our heart and brain in sync. Also, studies showing 40% improvement in long-term memory, 24% improvement in short-term memory, increased capacity and ability to focus, process information, as I mentioned earlier, faster reaction times. In fact, one very large study in high school population showed that students' ability to get into a coherent state in a laboratory condition predicted and was correlated with their future test scores, and also a capacity to learn. Also been a number of clinical focus studies. I won't, just out of time, go through all those, and I'll give some resources at the end of this if you want to look at some of the actual research papers and the hundreds of papers that have been published. But multiple studies now have shown that teaching people how to get into a coherent state reduces blood pressure. Both very quick state shifts in blood pressure, just getting coherent typically on average will reduce both systolic and diastolic blood pressure, systolic by about 10 to 15 points, but also in long-term hypertensive populations, significant reductions, reduced healthcare costs, improvements in HbA1c and different measures in diabetic population, heart failure improvements, reductions in arrhythmias, pretty significant improvements in asthma, pain reduction in a veteran population, significant improvements in ADHD, and multiple studies now in PTSD, in studies in law enforcement and correctional officers, lowered healthcare costs, lower stress, better family relations, all these types of things have been shown. So I won't belabor that. But so kind of talk a lot about this coherent state, which is reflected in our HRV, and which is ultimately a result of the heart and brain communicating and the quality of those signals going between the two. So I hope I've kind of given the understanding here. It's not just the brain down to the heart that creates the heart rate variability like used to be thought, but it really takes, in fact, it's just as important that the information that the heart's sending to the brain to create these rhythms and the patterns of these rhythms. So it's really the dynamic interaction between the heart and brain that's responsible for heart rate variability. That's the whole system that it's reflecting in. So we know that it's a great benefit both psychologically and for our physical health and clinical health to practice being in this higher ratios of time in this more coherent heart state. So once we really understood the physiology, that allowed us to develop a number of self-regulation techniques that, when used properly, shift our state into this more coherent heart state, which is associated with increased mental clarity, emotional stability, and as I mentioned earlier, especially when we're in challenging situations. So some of the techniques that we've developed are titled, well, heart-focused breathing is the first step in most of them, and that's one that you can use almost anytime, anywhere. Inner ease, quick coherence, freeze frame, which is really about decision making and out-of-the-box thinking, accessing our intuition. Heart lock-in, which is really more of a heart meditation in this case, although most of these techniques are really designed and meant to be used in the moment when we're running into the stresses of life or feeling anxious or overwhelmed and so on before making decisions. But attitude breathing is another one. Coherent communication prep technique are some of the core ones. There are others, but those are the core techniques in the HeartMath system. Now, we can really facilitate people learning these skills and getting into a coherent state when we give them feedback. So this is basically, in fact, the device here now called the M-Wave Pro was what started the whole industry. It used to be called the Freeze Framer, but it was the first consumer friendly, if you will, HRV coherence or HRV device of any kind to ever be sold and made, and really based on many years of research. So these devices allow people to self-monitor, and when you use one of the techniques, self-regulation techniques, am I shifting into this coherent state? And what we see over time, a few weeks, with practice, that you actually are starting to train your nervous system. So this becomes the new familiar state. That's a whole other topic that's really important. So this becomes automatic. But if you're going to retrain your physiology, it's really important to get the feedback to make sure you're really training it into truly the coherent or optimal state. So the M-Wave Pro is mostly used by healthcare professionals, multi-user database, and has games and a lot of fun ways to engage your clients or patients and train them the self-regulation techniques and monitor their physiology as they're using them. There's also a personal training device called Inner Balance that works for any smartphone, Android, or iOS, iPhone devices. That's pretty inexpensive and got a lot of fun interactive ways to feedback your coherence and track your progress and see that your skills are building over time. So that's kind of a overall, hopefully, summary of what we mean by personal coherence at our both emotional level, operational coherence we call it, our ability to really flow through the day, flow through the stresses and challenges with greater ease and grace. Social coherence now has to do with, when we're talking about obviously more than one person, but couples, families, but especially groups and teams. And this can also apply to entire communities and organizations. So what we mean by a socially coherent group is when they're able to achieve stable, harmonious alignment of the relationships, which allows for the efficient flow and utilization of the group's energy and the communication required for optimal collective cohesion and purpose. So that's kind of a scientific definition. That really gets down into how well we can sort out our problems with each other and get along with each other and really collaborate and get along and cooperate. And we're currently doing a lot of work on this, developing a new technology platform to measure the heart rhythm coherence of a group and how synchronized the various group members are. I'd like to kind of delve into one aspect of this that is often under the radar that people don't think about, and that is the energetic communication that goes on between people and within groups. So we've conducted many studies over the years that have confirmed that when we're in a heart coherent state, like I was talking about earlier, the heart actually radiates a more coherent magnetic signal, electromagnetic signal into the environment. And this magnetic signal can be detected by the nervous systems of other people and even animals. So the figure you see here on the right side of this graph is actually the real shape of the magnetic field produced by the heart. So when we put electrodes on a person that can measure the electrocardiogram or across their head to measure brain waves, we're measuring current flow. That's what we're actually measuring. But basic physics, every probably middle school student these days knows that whenever you have a flow of current, you produce a magnetic field. And magnetic fields and electric fields are two very different things. Although we call electromagnetism, they're very distinct types of fields with their own properties and so on. So when the heart beats, the current flows in the heart produce magnetic fields, and magnetic fields penetrate things. They go through things. In fact, that's why our cell phones work inside of buildings, is the magnetic component is able to penetrate through the walls and go through the windows and doors, or go right through a wall, actually. and communicate with the cell tower. And in the case of our cell phone, we're using pretty basic stuff. Another lifetime ago, I was a communications engineer for Motorola. So I know a lot about how to use magnetic fields, electromagnetic fields, to carry information. So when you're on your cell phone, having the call or sending your text or photo, it's being carried by the magnetic field, electromagnetic field, between your phone and the cell tower. And I'll probably come back to that analogy in a minute. So what I'm suggesting here is we work the same way. So we know that when the heart beats, it creates a magnetic field that radiates external to the body. Now, how do I know this? Well, we can measure it. So I'm not talking about an aura or something here that I can't measure yet in the lab anyway. But we can measure magnetic fields. And with today's equipment, called magnetometers, you can measure the cardiac field, or the magnetic field of the heart, about 3 feet away from the body. Now we know that field goes farther than that because we can measure the effects of it. That's just the current sensitivity of the magnetometers that are kind of practical to do. So when we measure detect these magnetic fields and measure the information carried by them, it's a technique called spectral analysis, very similar to what I used to use back in my days at Motorola to decode the information being carried by a radio or transmitter or whatever. Very similar. We can see that the magnetic field of the heart is at least carrying information about a person's emotional state. I'm sure that it's much more, but that's one thing we can actually decode and look at. So in this figure here on the left side, this is what appreciation looks like when you're looking at the spectral domain of the magnetic field, and anger on the right side. Okay, so we can see that these patterns are quite different and distinct. So just like with HRV, because the information being encoded in the field actually mathematically correlates exactly to the information encoded in the magnetic fields. So again, with about 75% accuracy, can tell what somebody's feeling from looking at the information being carried by the magnetic field. Now, kind of a fun way to illustrate a so what of this, it's here. This is a picture you see here. This is Josh, who's my son in this case, and Mabel, his dog at the time. And my son is now, Josh is in his early 30s. And he was 12 at the time we did this experiment, which has been a classic that everybody remembers. So being family members made them automatic research subjects. So we asked Josh and Mabel to come over to one of the labs and wired them up with recorders to record their electrocardiogram and measure their HRV, their heart rate variability. And what you see on top of this figure is Mabel and her HRV, her heart rhythms. And then you can see over on the far left, they're kind of chaotic and all over because she's in a lab now that's off limits normally and having a good time exploring and sniffing around. And Josh's HRV, heart rhythms, is on the bottom. And he was asked to go into the same room, same lab where Mabel was, but not to interact, not to pet her, to touch her, talk to her, anything like that. Just quietly go in, have a seat, and do one of the heart math techniques called a heart lock-in, which is where you get into a coherent state, focus on the heart, but actually send out love and appreciation or care to somebody. In this case, he did this with Mabel. And you can see on the bottom that his heart rhythm shifted while he did that into a very coherent rhythm. But look what happened on top to Mabel. There's no physical contact here. They're quite a ways apart, in fact. So we see that Mabel, the dog's heart rhythm, shifted into a coherent state as well. So this is showing an energetic communication. And we've done this many times. In fact, we've got another project now we're working on with dogs specifically. So this is actually pretty easy to do. And it turns out dogs and horses as well, as it turns out, are very sensitive, their heart rhythms, to reflecting emotional states of humans. So this is kind of a fun thing to measure. In fact, this was even done following our research in a TV commercial not too long ago for one of the pet food companies. Actually demonstrated this real time. Now, here's take more science into the equation here. This is an experiment that was done as a PhD dissertation study, a very well done study. And what this researcher did is he took 40 people, and 4 at a time, had them sit around a table, and 3 of the people had been trained 2 weeks prior how to shift in and sustain a coherent state. And the 4th person, who was part of the study of each of the groups of 4, was naive. They had no training and didn't know what the study was about. They were all wired up to devices to simultaneously measure their electrocardiograms, and so that their HRV could be sorted out and measured for coherence. And it was a long, complex protocol. It doesn't really matter. But the main question was when the 3 people who had been trained were randomly signaled to shift into a coherent state, the 4th person not knowing when or what was going on. Did it have a measurable impact on that fourth person? And the answer is yes, it did. Overall, a highly significant effect. So what this proved was that when we're in a coherent state, that energetic field environment that I'm talking about, this magnetic field environment, is detected by the nervous systems of other people, and it can actually have a lifting effect on them. They become more coherent. So there's a lot of implications of this. If you're in healthcare, if you're a healthcare provider or a coach, our state affects our clients. In education, I mean, I could go on and on here, that many examples of why this is important and how we can measure this. Now, this is just a kind of one example. We've done lots of studies to show people at quite long distances, conversational distances. You can have measurable energetic dances going on between our physiological rhythms. For example, my brain waves could be synchronizing to your heart and vice versa, even though we're 5 feet and even longer apart. So this is just a very small window into what we mean by social coherence and the work we're doing there to facilitate that. But we already, and we're putting a lot more energy and focus on this now, but some of the outcomes that have already been shown in published work are increased positive energy and teamwork, enhanced communication. They look to really listen to each other more deeply and not make as many mistakes. One of the ones that a lot of people really ping on or like hearing is shorter meeting times. Not as much energy is going into the lack of listening and so on. Fewer mistakes and errors, more creativity in finding solutions, helping the group see things from a new perspective, kind of also collective intuition, faster and more accurate decision making, and so on. So here's an example of really the outplay or benefits of increasing social coherence. And this data that you're seeing here is from a little over 10,000 healthcare workers. So these are nurses and doctors in various hospitals around the United States that we've worked with over the last few years and kind of combined their data. So we see significant improvements in positive outlook, gratitude, motivation, calmness. But what I'd like to especially draw your attention to is the big change we see in fatigue. And whether it's exhaustion, fatigue, the different scales we use, it's on average about between 40 and 50% of nurses in our hospitals in the United States are reporting being extremely fatigued and exhausted often or all the time. So they're really not having the energy they need to really do their jobs well and perform well. We see that is reduced almost in half, pretty much. You see it in this analysis of 10,000 people. So by really learning to get along better and learning to self-regulate our own emotions, one of the big benefits is our own energy level. We have a lot more energy at the end of the day to do the things we love to do, for example. But also big changes in anger management, resentfulness, these social types of things, and a lot of stress symptoms as well. And this is the same thing in almost 6,000 people in corporations, different corporations like Boeing and Motorola and different ones that we've worked with. So you see it's sustained. And pretty much you can be guaranteed if you really learn to get the heart and brain in sync and really live from a more coherent space that there's a lot of benefits in our for us. And here's, for example, the physical symptoms of stress. So one of the things we almost always see is better sleep, big reductions in body aches and pain, indigestion, and so on, muscle tension, headaches, and so on. So that's kind of just a very brief little window into social coherence. I'll be talking a lot more about this in the future as we're developing these new programs and technologies and also ways of measuring social coherence. So I'd like to take this last few minutes and section and talk about global coherence. If you recall at the beginning, I said there's really three domains of coherence that we like to kind of put things in: personal coherence and our physiological coherence, social, and then global coherence. So one of our special projects, research projects from the HeartMath Institute, is what we call the Global Coherence Initiative. And this is really the science or the study of how humanity and the Earth are interconnected via as we'll see, the magnetic fields of the Earth. So here's our high-level hypotheses. First is that, well, the first one's not really a hypothesis because this is well established, hundreds of papers on this that have established this. But human and animal health, our cognitive functions, our emotions and behaviors are affected by the background planetary magnetic and energetic fields. Okay? So that's actually well established. And I'll show you one kind of classic example of that in a moment. This is where we get a little bit broader. And the second hypothesis here is that the Earth's magnetic fields are carriers of biologically relevant, and I would say patterned information that interconnects and connects all living systems. So earlier I used the example of the cell phone, of our body working the same way, and the magnetic fields we're radiating, carrying information. Certainly about our emotions, but we feel probably much more will be discovered in the future about what type of information is being carried by that field. We're basically suggesting Earth's doing the same thing. We all live within the Earth's magnetic field. And what we're really suggesting here is that our magnetic fields, especially our heart's magnetic field, couple with and connect with the Earth's magnetic field and transfer information. I won't be able to go into all the science and background of this, but this is a fairly solid theory with a surprising amount of support. And if anybody's interested in that, I published a recent little book called The Science of Interconnectivity that really goes into all these hypotheses in much greater detail and depth. So building on the second one, we're suggesting here that we're all basically coupled with and thus feeding, right, or if you will, or affecting and creating a global information field. And thus that large numbers of people who are really intentional about creating heart-centered states of care, love, kindness, compassion, can generate more coherent field environments that will benefit others and help offset the current planetary-wide discord and incoherence. So two main halves of GCI. One is members and people who are actually acting as coherence builders and intentionally doing this kind of work, and there's well over 200,000 people that are involved on that level. And then the research side, which I'm also very much involved in. So let me give you one example, kind of a historical, the first person that really was seriously looking at this kind of work. And that's a guy named Alexander Chesovsky, who was a Russian astrophysicist who got drafted into World War I. And being an astrophysicist, he was keeping one eye on what the sun was doing and the activity of the sun. But meanwhile, he was down here on Earth in the middle of a war. And it occurred to him, or he observed that during high solar activity and solar disturbances and magnetic field disturbances and so on, that people down here on Earth just kind of got crazy, did more stupid things, basically. So that intrigued him. So after the war, he did an exhaustive study of human history, a very impressive body of work. And he ended up creating what he called the Index of Mass Human Excitability. Was kind of the output of this. So this figure you're seeing here is from his original data. So this is kind of, let me explain what you're seeing here. On the top, in blue, if we start on the top graph on the far left, we're in 1749. And then we go across through the 1930s, and then it wraps around on the bottom blue graph up to 1929. And this is when he published this work. So what the blue line is showing is there's basically a dot each year for the number of major human events that occurred that year. Major human events are things like start of a war, revolutions, major discoveries, things that had global implication. Okay? So that's simply what the blue line is. Each year, the number of major human events. The red line on the bottom of the two graphs is the solar cycle for the same time period. Kind of just look at that and say, obviously there's a very strong correlation there when you can see it like this. All right, so the correlation between the solar cycle and the human activity levels and major human events is pretty obvious when you look at this figure. So the way I like to think of this, kind of keep it simple, is during the solar cycle peaks, as the solar cycle is going up, the sun is emitting more energy, immeasurably, and we know this. They didn't know that at the time in the way we do now, in many different levels and types of energy. And what we're starting to see in some of the new research we're doing now is that it actually looks like we're pretty good evidence for that we actually absorb and utilize that energy. So when we have more energy, we, depending upon how well self-regulated we are, it depends on how we use and outgate that energy. So if we're not well self-regulated, we have this energy influx, we tend to start arguments. If you're a politician, start wars. In fact, 80%, if you look at all of human history that we have data on, the start of wars, the onset of war started within 80% started within a very narrow period around the peak of those solar cycles. Way past chance, okay? Or we can take that same energy and use it to invent new things, create new collaborations. So during those same solar high activities are also the greatest periods of human flourishing in the arts, the sciences, and many things. So let's just kind of give that as a backdrop here, but of course in more modern research we've got a lot more insight into what's doing what. Now to do research around this, to do science, we have to measure things. So as part of the Global Coherence Initiative, we're installing a global network of extremely sensitive magnetometer sites. And these are sites, magnetometers, that are specifically designed to measure the resonant frequencies and the what are called time varying, or the moving parts of the magnetic field of the Earth, which is different than the strength of the static or DC field. And this is what the site here in California looks like. But we have these sites around the world. Saudi Arabia is one, Lithuania, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, one going in shortly in Brazil. Not Brazil, but Colombia. So this is what the site here looks like. So these are ultra-sensitive magnetometers, some of the most sensitive in the world for this type of thing, in fact. So what are we measuring that's relevant here? So if we look at the Earth, this is kind of an idealized figure of the Earth's magnetic field. It's far more complex, but basically we know we have a north and a south pole. This is what we call the geomagnetic field, the thing our compasses tune into. And the magnetic field of the Earth is absolutely critical for life on Earth, at least as we know it. And the magnetic field extends around from the Earth out into space hundreds of thousands of miles. And it's a protective shield that protects us from cosmic radiation and the solar wind and so on. But it's a pure magnetic field, kind of like a refrigerator magnet, right? That's just a magnetic field. It's always there, and it's the magnitude or the strength of the field. Yeah, it changes, but very gradually. It's over hundreds to thousands of years. So the DC component in terms of health and behavior effects is, most of the data suggests it's not one of the main drivers. However, if you remember back in science class, most of us got to do an experiment somewhere along the way where we got to dump iron filings on a glass plate and put the magnet under it, and you kind of tap the plate and all the iron filings would magically move and line up in these lines showing you the shape of the magnetic field. Right? And so this is a cross-section you see here of the magnetic field, which is a donut, basically, or torus-shaped field. So those filings lined up in lines, and those are called flux lines in magnetic language. And here's what I'd like you to do. Think of the Earth's, these field lines you see in our diagram here, the magnetic flux lines of the Earth. Think of them like guitar strings, because they really do act like that. And these are called field line resonances. When they get plucked, they vibrate, just like a guitar string. So we know when you pluck a string on a stringed instrument like a guitar, it vibrates. And it has a resonant frequency, or a certain pitch that note vibrates at. And if you change the tension of the string, it changes its frequency or note. Earth works exactly the same way. So the magnetic field lines of the Earth are vibrating. Now what's plucking the strings is the solar wind. So the solar wind is very different than the day-night stuff we see, the photons. It's the high energy particles, the stuff, kind of substance, if you will, being blown out of the sun. And the solar wind travels on a quiet day about 1 million miles per hour. And if we have solar flares and big disturbances, it can actually jump up to 4 or 5 million miles per hour. But the solar wind is strong enough, the pressure of it, that it pushes in and compresses the Earth's magnetic field on the daytime side of the planet and stretches it out on the nighttime side. And meanwhile, Earth is turning, and so is the sun in all this. So as the solar wind is rushing by, it's plucking the strings of the magnetic field, and they're vibrating. In fact, there's new data I don't have time to show you today that actually is able to visualize this from some of the new satellites. You can actually see the vibrating field lines. Now, when we measure these resonant frequencies, these field line resonances, this is a graph of those. And one of the fundamentals, and this has been known for a long time within the silo of the people that study these things, is that one of the fundamental resonant frequencies is 0.1 hertz. That's the first peak you see over on the far left of this graph. So 1.1 hertz is relevant for our discussion because it's exactly the same frequency as the coherent heart rhythm you see on the bottom here. In other words, when we're coherent, we're in that optimal state, which is naturally reflected when we feel good, when we're caring for each other, appreciating, being kind to each other, having those kind of positive emotions. This is the rhythm and the mode our heart flips into. It's exactly the same frequency as Earth's primary resonant frequency. Okay, I'll come back to this in a minute. Now, another set of magnetic frequencies that are relevant for this discussion are called Schumann resonances. Now, these are magnetic waves that you could think of as being trapped between the surface of the Earth and the bottom of the ionosphere. If you're not familiar with the ionosphere, think of it as a big soap bubble around the planet. It starts about 50 miles up and goes out to about 100 to 150 miles, depending upon conditions. And it's a layer of what's called plasma, the fourth state of matter in physics. And plasmas do have some special properties, especially when they're threaded with magnetic fields like the ionosphere is. But to keep it simple for this, the bottom of the ionosphere reflects magnetic waves. In fact, this is how ham radio operators work. You send your radio signal up, it hits the ionosphere and bounces off, and that's how somebody in the United States can talk to somebody in England or China or wherever. And if you're really lucky, you get a second bounce, and now you're talking to, Australia and South Africa and places like that. So these are called Schumann resonances because they were first mathematically predicted by a German researcher named Otto Schumann. So they were named after him. But these are technically called globally propagating standing waves. Okay, that translates to simple language of they're everywhere all the time. And there's 8 of these resonant frequencies. And the first one is 7.8 hertz, right? Then 14 hertz, 20 hertz, and so on. Now, once these were first measured in 1960, this is relatively new science, it was immediately recognized that this is the same frequencies as our human brain waves. So especially the 7.8, which most people have heard of and don't know, but there's actually 8 of them, is very near the alpha wave. Depending upon what model you use, it's either low alpha or high other states. But anyway, it's one of the resonant frequencies of the human brain. So it turns out we now know that all of these resonant frequencies, these Schumann resonances, overlap with human brain waves. So what I've just shared with you here is that Earth is vibrating, if you will, literally, singing away in 2 different modes. Field line resonances, which are the same frequency as our hearts, and these are much stronger in amplitude magnetic waves, and then Schumann resonances, which are much weaker, that overlap with our brain waves. So you might remember back to science class when we got to play with tuning forks. You have 2 tuning forks and you tap one and it vibrates, but the other starts magically vibrating, seemingly magically with it, demonstrating the principle of resonance. Now, one of the things they didn't teach us usually back in science class was that tuning forks are coherent systems. Without coherence, you can't have resonance. So in the case of our tuning forks, it's air molecules that are transmitting the energy and information between the 2 tuning forks. But magnetic waves work exactly the same way. You just don't need the air molecules. Back to our cell phones, right? When I'm in this room now, and there's probably 1,000 cell phone conversations going on around me right now. So how does my phone pick out the one that it wants? We quite literally tune the receiver to have a resonant connection, to be resonant with the frequency we want, and suddenly the energy and information gets transferred from the air into the antenna, into our phone, and voila, we're having a phone conversation. So basically, when you have 2 systems vibrating or resonating at the same frequency, you can transfer energy and information. So here we are as humanity, our brains and hearts are vibrating at the same frequency as Earth. So at least we have the physics that would suggest that we can couple with and transfer energy and information. I won't have time today, but there's quite a few studies that show this is exactly what's happening between our brains and these resonant frequencies. Now I'm going to share one study with you because this is pretty exciting and it's brand new, and some of the things that this is not yet published, but should be here shortly. So we did several studies leading up to this, but I'm just going to share. This is a large study internationally where we had over 100 people, 100 participants in 5 countries, and wearing these HRV recorders for 24/7, 24 hours a day for several weeks. And this was to really follow up on some other studies where we found that groups of people in remotely, vastly different locations, their heart rhythms were synchronized. They did not expect this. And so we've discovered a couple of new things here. One is there's a much slower wave in our heart rhythms than the typical ones that people are used to knowing about and seeing. So we are actually calling this the slow wave rhythm. And it's very real and been replicated now in multiple studies. And when we first saw this, that the people were synchronizing their heart rhythms in this slow wave rhythm across the state, right? And didn't even know each other. We realized later that this must be because that humanity is synchronizing to something in the environment, and that turned out to be the resonant frequencies in the Earth's magnetic field. First time anybody, as far as we know, has ever seen this like this. And I don't think anybody ever thought to look at it before. So we did this larger study with people in these 5 countries. They were Saudi Arabia, Lithuania, and here in California, and some in England. And what you see here on the left side of this graph is that the black line is the power in the time-varying magnetic field, the resonant frequencies, the Schumann resonances in this case. And the blue line is a group made up of all of these groups around the world. And again, the correlation is phenomenal. You can actually see it in the data. In other words, from a subgroup here in this case is from all these other groups, their heart rhythms are synchronized, even though they're in vastly different time zones, like 10-hour differences in some cases. So they're synchronized together and synchronized to the Earth's magnetic field. So we like to say, well, on some level, we're all in sync, or we're all connected. Well, no, we really are, and we're able to start measuring that now. Now, here's an interesting thing. We actually found 3 subgroups out of this larger group. The group on the right that you see here, this is a group that's still synchronized together as a group. The black line is the same black line that's on the other graph. It's the Schumann resonance power. But this group is having exactly the opposite response to the same signal in the environment. Okay, so they're still synchronized to a group, together as a group, but having the exact opposite response to the same environmental signal. And there was a third group that wasn't synchronized to each other or the Earth. And our hypothesis right now, working hypothesis, is we don't really know why, what it is about the differences in the people yet. That'll be future research. But it's probably not the group you want to be in. It's probably not that group that's out of sync with each other and the Earth itself. And I could talk a lot more about why I say that, but that would be probably taking a little bit too long for today. Now here's also the ULF power, or this is the field line resonances, the big strong magnetic field, the field line resonances, the vibrating guitar string example I used. So here we see which is the black line again, and the groups HRV globally. So we see strong correlation here again. In fact, what the data is really showing us is that it's the rhythms of the Earth that correlate with our heart, that are the same as our heart, are the big drivers. They're the really important ones, although the Schumanns are also important. So what I'm really sharing with you here is what we're seeing now is this brand new data that we really are, humanity really is synchronized at the level of the heart. Our rhythms are in sync with each other and with the Earth. And some of the newer data actually that we just reviewed, it'll be published, be written out to be published soon, found that as part of this larger study we did, the groups did a heart lock-in together as a group for 15 minutes. Each of the groups did, and then we did a big lock-in where we all did it together, synchronized around the world. But what the group and the Lithuanian group, the researchers there who we collaborate with have found is that after that group did the heart lock-in, at the group level, they became more synchronized as a group and to the Earth's field. And just from that one 15-minute exercise of doing the heart lock-in together, it had a two-day carryover effect. They became more synchronized, not locally, as a group, with the group and the Earth that lasted for 2 days just from one 15-minute of getting in a coherent heart together. Okay? So my final thoughts, what I'd like to leave you with here is, if we're right about this, is that every individual is contributing to the global field environment. And each person's thoughts, emotions, and intentions are affecting the field. And this is always going on. It's not just when we come together to do a meditation or a prayer for global peace or these type of positive outcomes. Those are important and they do amplify it. We have pretty good data to suggest that that's true, but we're always feeding the field. So what about the times we're not doing our meditation together and things? It's always feeding the field. So what I'd really like to leave you with is really maybe start becoming more aware of and consideration of what am I feeding the field? Right? Maybe at the end of the day, ask yourself, well, how much did I feed the field today that was really being kinder, more appreciative, compassionate to my family, coworkers, and just people, versus how much of the time or the ratio of the day was I feeding the field anxiety or feelings of overwhelm or frustration or impatience because my to-do list wasn't getting done fast enough, or I was in the traffic jams, literally or figuratively in life, because it all counts. And this is where it really takes individual self-responsibility for what our own energies are and what we're feeding the field, because I am suggesting here that it really all counts. Okay. So that's the end of what I wanted to share with you today. I would like to say here that there are some resources if you would like to learn more about anything I've shared, much more in depth. We have a research library on the heartmath.org website that has hundreds of free downloads, PDFs of published papers. There's a new book called Science of the Heart that's a pretty extensive book that really reviews, it's got chapters that really reviews the work on the heart-brain. What I didn't talk about today, a whole chapter on our work on intuition as well, and then research in the organizations, schools, and so on. And also a final chapter that kind of summarizes the Global Coherence Initiative as well. And it's well referenced and kind of a summary of a lot of things. And our latest book, also, Heart Intelligence, would be a recommended read. I think that you would get a lot out of as well. So thank you for taking the time to share your time with me today, and I wish you all a good day.
Quantum University is the world's largest institution of higher learning to provide online degrees and certification programs in holistic, alternative, natural, and integrative medicine based on the science of quantum physics. The International Quantum University for Integrative Medicine, IQUIM, also known as Quantum University, is an online degree-granting institution located in the state of Hawaii in downtown Honolulu. Students can earn bachelor's, master's, doctorate and PhD degrees, leading to professional board certifications. Quantum University's mission is to build a new future for medicine, one student at a time. Graduates of Quantum University take their health and wellness career to the next level and follow their dreams to start a new, exciting, successful and meaningful career in integrative medicine.